Hey folks, and welcome to a bonus edition of the Jank Tank. Unfortunately, our highly charismatic host Tim is not with us, and I will be serving as an inferior substitute. I am joined today by Teld, and we are going to be talking about a particular cube that we designed as a side project. It's kind of a labor of love for both of us. And this is a cube that we call Neo Reloaded. Before we get into how the particular cube functions, what we changed and everything, I just want to call out that we draft, actually recently, Teld, we've been firing like two concurrent pods for a lot of our drafts, like 16 players.
Yeah, we usually say we draft on like Wednesday and Sunday evenings, but honestly, we've been firing drafts like Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, Wednesday. Just it's been the Jank Diver Discord has been firing on all cylinders lately.
It really has.
Really great.
There's been an influx, I think, of people from the. It's not an advertisement. I'd say the link to our community on Draftmancer, and we didn't initially see a huge uptick in active players, but I'm beginning to think that that was because of the direct challenge bug that existed for months that people were finding really frustrating and was discouraging them from drafting. And okay, so historically, we would draft the peasant cube or some community members' alternative cube, like Mop. Our admin Mop Beeble has a number of cool side project cubes that we would draft, and that was at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesdays. That is still sort of a sanctioned draft night. So if you're interested in Peasant Cube, you want to come check us out on Wednesday evenings. That's when we draft. And then historically, the other sanctioned event, or I guess scheduled event is rather how I should put it, was Sunday evenings at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, drafting our unrestricted cube, although we're kind of reconsidering that name at the moment.
It is because it's very restricted.
It is quite restricted relative to our admin Mop Beeble's cube, which used to be called the Fun Restricted, is I now think being called the Timeless Cube, and that it contains cards like Channel and Natural Order and Sneak Attack and Dark Ritual and stuff that we don't play in our mainline cube. Anyway, that was a scheduled event, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays. As of late, we have been firing drafts on Friday night and Saturday night, an afternoon draft on Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then also the 7:30 draft. And the afternoon draft can occasionally be our standard mainline cube, but is often an alternative cube. And we wanted to do an episode on this Neo Reloaded cube today because we actually fired a pod of it last night. This is being recorded on Saturday, January the 20th. So one of our now seemingly standard Friday night drafts featured a pod drafting Tim's artifact-centric Affinity Cube, and then our Neo Reloaded Cube. A couple of resources I want to shout out, we always do before we get into the meat of the episode. Thank you to Draftmancer, run by Senroku, which makes our drafting process, and by extension our ability to play cube matches, possible. That's draftmancer.com. And then obviously Cube Cobra is just the premier cube list storage, test drafter, content. It's the mothership for the hobby, and we want to shout them out as well. The tools that they provide also make what we're doing in our community possible. So drop into their donation bins, buy them a coffee. In any case, the episode's main topic today is going to be how we sort of designed, how we reworked what we're calling the Neo Reloaded Cube. And as the name suggests, well, first of all, Neo Reloaded is kind of a lame reference to the Matrix. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is a essentially set plus cube based on the core framework of the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty draft format, which was a beloved, complex, all-timer format for a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah, it's right now I have it, I think, as my number 2 of all time, and sometimes I would probably call it number 1. So it's very high up there.
I think it's my number 1. Just they did a really fantastic job of blending permanent types matter and sort of focusing the emphasis on those permanent types mattering in different concentrations and like a spectrum across the color combination. Ninjas is always super fun. Just a lot. It was also a format that supported like mono red aggro decks and 5-color green decks. The fixing was pretty good. So there was just a lot of creativity.
Wild the range of gameplay you have in that format. Just, you know, it's very rare that you can have like the best decks be like a 1-drop aggro deck, a 5-color mid-range deck, and then anything in between also works.
Yeah, exactly. So that made it, because we both love the format so much, and because there was so much going on structurally within the format that really worked, it provided a really ideal framework for us to approach making a set cube.
Now, there are some major issues with this set, though. We do have to acknowledge them, and that's why we're here.
Correct. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff. Initially, this began almost exclusively as a pure set cube, with more than 90% of the cards hailing from the original set. As we've sort of taken steps to rework some things, improve the gameplay of certain color combinations, etc., we have looked to other sets to provide sort of glue cards for what we've been trying to accomplish.
We just checked. I believe we're at about, 3/4 of the cube is still...
75%.
Yeah.
Teld, do you want to take us through kind of what didn't work in the original Neo set limited?
Yeah. There are 3 color pairs that really just do not do the thing in Neo. The most egregious of these is green-red, and we'll get to it later. I'm still uncertain on this one. I don't know if it's fixable entirely. The other 2, however, I think we've done a pretty good job on. There's blue-white, which was supposed to be a vehicle deck, and then red-white that was supposed to be a samurai deck. And both of these colors could be playable, but they didn't do their thing, right? The samurai deck was not something that worked. The vehicle deck was not something that worked. If you were playing blue-white or red-white, you were doing something that was not advertised when you were playing. Additionally, blue-red had kind of the issue of being like the second fiddle color, where you didn't feel like you wanted to be in blue-red. There wasn't a big pull. Usually it felt like you just kind of got pushed into there because black-red wasn't open or mono-red wasn't open. And black-white, you know, it was somewhere in the middle. We felt like it could use just a little bit of tuning as well to really make those mechanics pop. That sort of balance thing that it had going on.
Right. Speaking of green-red, I think green-red would have maybe functioned in the set a little bit better if the modified payoffs didn't all completely suck.
Yeah.
All of the payoffs for doing the thing, and the thing was difficult to do, right? Because like green was the most enchantment focused color, red was the most artifact focused color, so there really wasn't a lot of there really weren't any enchantment payoffs or artifact payoffs that worked particularly well in the deck, because you just weren't going to have like a high density of either one. And then in addition to all of that, the modified payoffs were things like 2/1 for 2 if you had a modified creature when it entered the battlefield, which like you're never going to have on turn 2, for example. It makes like a 1/1 token. And then there was like a ninja that got a +1/+1 counter.
Yeah, there's the iconic one was the 3 mana 2/3 that if you had a modified creature was a 3/4. It's like ooh. And that wasn't a good payoff. Even if you got the payoff, it wasn't very good. But if you didn't have a modified creature, which a lot of times you weren't going to have on turn 3, it was actively terrible. So there's really not a lot of going on there. There's a couple of payoffs that we've deemed good enough to try to build around, but they're really limited.
Yeah, and one of the things that I actually liked tremendously about this set, and like I kind of hope it's not like a Neo mechanic in the future, I kind of hope that they evergreen it, is modified. There's equipment matters stuff historically in Magic. There's +1/+1 counter stuff that historically matters in Magic. There's aura stuff that matters in Magic, right? And modified, those of you that don't know, is like any creature that has any type of counter on it, has an aura attached to it, or is equipped, counts as modified. So we have these historically fairly parasitic things that require you to either be like all in on equipment, all in on like auras like boggles or whatever, and then like all in on +1/+1 counter synergies. And modified cards provide these, if they printed any good ones, theoretically provide sort of glue cards between these various effects. So you could just play the best auras, the best +1/+1 counter enablers, and the best equipment, and have these modified cards serve as a through line that pays you for doing all of these things. So modified as a concept, I think, is incredibly cool, and I hope that they continue to use that going forward in Magic's history.
And we don't just say that because we want some green-red modified payoffs that are actually worthwhile. Actually, we do. That's exactly why we say that. Watsy, please, come on, give it to us.
But yeah, the archetype just didn't work because the payoffs themselves were quite weak, and the modified stuff was like fairly parasitic. In any case, I think that that's like a pretty decent sum up of what didn't work. So as we mentioned, Artifact Aggro was a good focus deck. There was like all these multicolor enchantment piles that were sick.
There's the blue-black tempo deck, the ninja stuff.
Yeah, that worked fantastic. But there were just like a couple of archetypes that just straight up really didn't work. And I think when you're designing a cube, I'm not going to say that everyone should think this way, but I personally find it problematic when you design a limited environment where there is a color or color combination that's just much weaker than everything else. We've discussed this on other episodes before. Actually, I think we actually discussed it in the last episode on setting your parameters for building a cube. It's going to be right for someone at the table to be drafting a particular color pair because those are just going to be the cards that are being passed to them. And putting them in a situation where they're drafting an archetype that's like inherently inferior or doesn't work either leads them to draft a deck that they know is not going to be effective because the mechanics don't work, or it's going to lead them to force something else that's not actually open, which not only kind of train wrecks their draft, but also kind of train wrecks someone else's. So I find that all inherently problematic. So let's talk about what we changed.
Yeah, I think our goal here ultimately with green-red, because they were so diametrically opposed, because green-red was so unplayable, our goal is to make it where green-red is not a trap, right? That maybe you aren't going out of your way to draft green-red, but if you end up in the green-red seat where green and red cards are flowing, you can build a deck that works and you can like conceivably compete, right? You can get go 2-1 or something. And maybe you aren't going to 3-0 because the synergy just isn't there. There's a super high synergy environment and we're working with what we got. But it's about not feeling like, oh, I drafted green-red, I'm about to 0-3, right? We want you to feel like you can at least make your deck work. And so we've made some changes to that. We'll talk about all the different changes or a bunch of the different changes we've made. But that's kind of the goal, I think, with some of these really low-performing archetypes is to get them out of the basement where you feel like you're in an okay spot and maybe even excited.
Right. So let's talk like specifics about what we changed. So first of all, the goal was to ensure that the expected strategies that were good in the original set retain their identity and retain their playability, while bolstering the less played color combinations and actually, in some cases, transform them almost completely into something that works.
Two cards that I think are a really good example of this in Neo are Spinning Wheel Kick and Suit Up. There have been very few sets where you could spend 6 mana or more trying to use a sorcery speed card that required you to have a creature in play and it be good. And there's not been a lot of sets where the Transformer Creature Combat trick has been particularly good. And both of these cards are very, very good cards in this format. And we wanted to make sure we retain that identity. Spinning Wheel Kick in this format is still a board buster. If you end up getting to 6 or 8 mana, you can set up lines where Spinning Wheel Kick wins you the game. And that's what we wanted to maintain.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. We didn't want a redesign of the environment that rendered iconic cards from the set that were good in the set mediocre or bad cards. We wanted to keep the good cards good, right? So when somebody sits down and drafts this and they see a Spinning Wheel Kick, which was a very high pick in the original format, it's still a good thing to take highly here.
Imperial Oath still bricks the game.
Yeah.
You don't see it. You don't get past Imperial Oaths, and if your opponent makes it to 6 mana, cast their Imperial Oath, and you don't have a bunch of flyers, you are probably in a bad spot.
Right. That's another good example. In general, as well, we attempted where possible to avoid like really flagrant flavor breaks, even if the card like worked well. There are a few of them, like Thraben Inspector, that just like, although I guess you can make the argument, like Portuguese colonists wore those dorky hats. But in any case, we wanted to avoid flagrant flavor breaks where possible. So we tended to go for non-Neo cards that are either really generic looking and not obviously tied to a very different specific setting, or in the case of like the Mother of Machines cards that we included, actively have Kamigawa art. So despite the fact that they're not Neo cards, they look aesthetically sort of contiguous in packs.
For those of you listening at home, he means March of the Machines, the interplanar set. So those cards are actually Kamigawa cards, and they're cards that are on the plane of Kamigawa.
Right. My understanding is that original Kamigawa was like a weird set that didn't feature a lot of cards that have like held up particularly well, but we don't even have that on the client, so it just wasn't an option. So let's get into the specific rework. So we've already talked a little bit about green-red, but more or less what we did was we added support around making like Renegade Upriser a 2-mana 5/3. We also used stuff. Which set was oil? Was it one? Had the oil counters?
It was. Yeah. We've got a number of the oil counter cards because those were cards that they were willing to place counters on that didn't actually impact things. So we can kind of cheat a little bit with our modified cards and have them come in pre-modified.
Okay, so like a good example would be Furnace Strider from 1. So Furnace Strider is 4 and a red for a 4/5, which is an okay rate, not amazing. But it enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. You can remove an oil counter from Furnace Strider. Target creature you control gains haste until end of turn. So effectively, you don't necessarily have to play the card this way, but it's essentially like a 5-mana 4/5 haste that can give your next big threat haste. And we've also included, not a ton of cards like this, but we've included Malthus Revolutionary, which is a 3/3 trample for 3. When it enters the battlefield or dies, for each type of counter on target permanent or player, give that permanent or player another counter of that kind. So this can add additional oil counters to cards that spend oil counters that do powerful things, like Furnace Strider, to kind of tie that together.
Or lore counters.
Or lore counters for your sagas, exactly.
One of the lies that hasn't come up that we thought was pretty cool that could conceivably come up with both of these cards is using Malthus Revolutionary to flip your sagas faster, or line up your saga so that it flips the turn you play your Furnace Strider, and then you use the Furnace Strider to give it and the saga haste and get a big swing. Right. So these are the kind of ways that we're trying to leverage those things that Green was really good at, which is taking the slow, grindy gameplay with Saga, like a Boseiju, right? You play turn 4, Boseiju shelters and then like maybe a turn or two down the road, when it flips, you can use that Furnace Strider to immediately get a swing in with it, and now you've leveraged that grindy card as an aggressive card. It remains to be seen how well this is going to work. I wish I had more data or empirical evidence to explain to people, but unfortunately, nobody has drafted green-red, so it is still appears to be an off-ramp, but we do have a number of cards that do kind of synergize with this. The Evolving Adaptive, for example, from 1 comes in pre-modified. It gets bigger as you play these big creatures that we're putting in the color. Malthus Revolutionary makes it bigger. And you can kind of see a game plan coming together when you're drafting your deck where this would actually be good.
Right. One card that we did consider including briefly was like Evolution Sage, which is 3 mana for a 3/2 landfall proliferate. And we thought, oh, this would be cool to increase the number of +1/+1 counters or oil counters on stuff. But then we also realized that this would be a way for the green enchantment decks, which are already good decks, to basically just power out all 3 chapters of their saga and get all that value faster and then flip them.
We also remembered that the card Generous Visitor exists, and it's like, okay, well, you put a +1 counter on things, and it's like, now you're just proliferate. It's like, okay, this would just be better in the green soup decks. Never mind.
Right. Basically, what this worked out as, like, there's some kind of countery stuff going on to the extent that we could actually make it work. Red isn't traditionally a +1/+1 counter deck, and green is kind of secondary after white in the white-green +1/+1 counter strategies that have historically been supported in other sets. But we sort of did our best to provide stuff where like modified actually matters. The only true payoff for it, because as we mentioned, most of the payoffs are pretty bad, was Renegade Upriser. We wanted to, as consistently as possible, make that a 2-mana 5/3.
The other payoff that we're running, and this one actually is kind of also good with the Furnace Strider, is Walking Skyscraper, or is that the name of the card? I believe?
I forgot about that.
Skyscraper.
Yep.
Yeah, we added that recently, and this is another card that if you can get 3 or 4 modified creatures into play, which, again, a lot of our cards come in pre-modified now, you can get a pretty undercosted 8/8 partially hexproof creature with trample and if you get a Furnace Rider and you slam this on like turn 6, even if you only had 2 modified creatures and you give it haste, you're probably winning the game, right? Like this is slapping for a lot of damage. And that felt like the like late game payoff that you could get for having a number of modified creatures. So those are the 2 that really made sense as far as, like cheap creature that is really aggressive and can push through a lot of damage, and then a late game expensive card that we can get down to a reasonable mana cost, which makes it an unreasonable Magic card.
Right. And there are Evolving Adaptive comes in with oil counters, Axiom Engraver, which is 2 mana for a 1/3 that rummages by spending oil counters, is also pre-modified. There's just like a couple of cheaper cards that come in pre-modified, and then like Furnace Strider into the Walking Skyscraper is obviously insane. So it's not inconceivable to go, like as you mentioned, Furnace Strider on 5, Skyscraper on 6, and just toss an 8/8 Trample Haste for 6 at your opponent, which is like charging Monster Store levels of insane, maybe even a little bit better than that. So in general, as we mentioned, like it's not like there's a ton of payoffs for this deck. What it largely ends up being is just an aggressively slanted traditional Gruul mid-range deck, right? With some flavor to it, which ultimately made it significantly more playable than the attempt at a synergy deck that they originally made. So actually, this is one conceit to mention now. Each of the the 2-color pairs features 2 copies of one of the flagship uncommons for what the color pair is doing. And in the case of the color pairs that actually already worked in the original set, it's just the same payoff. And then 1 copy of a different style of card, traditionally from a different set, that does something that also either reinforces the color pair or provides some like additional utility. In the case of Gruul, because this was a complete rework, we only are playing 1 copy of Invigorating Hot Spring. We are playing 2 copies of Arbalest Engineers from the Brothers' War. It is a 3-mana 2/2, and it does one of 3 things. It deals 1 damage to any target, which is actually very powerful in this environment because there were a lot of X1s. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains trample and haste until end of turn. So in this deck, it is theoretically possible to go pre-modified creature on 1, pre-modified creature on 2, cast Arbalest Engineers, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and for 3 mana, it's a 3/3. For the turn it attacks, trample haste with a counter on it. And then the third mode is creating a tapped Power Stone token, which can then be used to cast artifacts or just create an artifact for any artifact synergies you may have in your deck. So this is the 2-color uncommon that we chose for Gruul. We've probably talked Gruul to death at this point. Why don't we get into the reworks that actually kind of moved in a synergy direction? And Teld, I'm gonna have you take this first one. But one thing that I want to note before we get into the next 3 sort of reworks that we did was we decided, instead of these like parasitic, samurai vehicles, whatever, we're going to tie them into sort of the rich tapestry of possibilities of the artifacts or enchantments or some combination of the 2 mattered, to tie these previously highly parasitic color pairs into the broader themes of the set and make them work.
Yeah. So the blue-white rework is going to be where we decided vehicles just was not salvageable. The payoff isn't very good. There's not a lot of other support in other sets, and it just doesn't have anything in it that really pulls you into that. That being said, blue has a lot of good cards. There's a lot of artifacts, and not only are they a lot of artifacts, there's also the 2 best blue cards are both enchantments, right? There's Behold the Unspeakable and the Modern Age. White also has a good number of artifacts and enchantments, including some removal along with cards we added to give more artifacts to find. And so we kind of realized that we could, much like the black-white deck, we could tie this room together by making them a balanced deck if there was a payoff that was worth running. And it turns out, when we look back to Eldraine, there was actually Arcanist's Owl, which is a 4 hybrid blue-white for a 3/3 flying artifact creature. And when it ETBs, you get to look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal an enchantment or artifact from among them, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck. So if you construct your deck correctly, this is very frequently 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer that impulses, and it is very good. It is extremely strong. You can ninja flip it or bounce it and things like that occasionally to get more value. You can buy it back with restoration specialists that we've added. There are a number of lines of ways of even getting more advantage out of this card. But just on rate, a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that draws a card or that impulses a card is quite good. Mm-hmm. And so that was really our main payoff there.
And it itself is an artifact. That's also upside. It itself
is an artifact.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a few other cards. Hopefully we get some more cards down the road that are in this kind of balanced sphere, because we have a few of them right now and they're all really nice. It would just be nice to have a little bit more synergy for that. But it feels like a good deck. I played it last night, and while my record wasn't very good, I only went 1-2. I think I could have built the deck a little better. But when it was firing, when my draws were lining up and I wasn't drawing 11 lands, it actually felt really powerful. It had a lot of grind. You could compete with the green decks. You could potentially get on board fast enough to occasionally get under the red decks. I think I should have hedged more towards that, because I do think the natural grindy nature of the deck made me pretty solid against the green decks. It gave me a pretty decent game. It was really just getting run over that was the problem. So the blue-white deck seems to work pretty well. It doesn't feel like a trap anymore. It feels like a deck that I'm like pretty happy drafting. You get to play a lot of the most powerful cards in the format. You can play Imperial Oath and Behold the Unspeakable, and you can play the Modern Age. And these are all like Spirited Companion. These are all really good cards in this deck.
So for those of you that are maybe not as familiar with Neo, the black-white theme in Neo was cards that care about you having an artifact and or an enchantment. And by making the blue-white deck do a very, very similar thing, just in different colors, because the fixing in Neo is actually pretty decent, this opens you up to draft like an Esper balance deck, which opens up even more solid artifacts and enchantments for you to tutor for, impulse with Arcanist Owl. Actually, I've seen someone Arcanist Owl draw another Arcanist Owl, which is pretty amazing because it itself is an artifact. So yeah, there's a lot of value to be had here, and it actually has an identity that like works with the set themes. And actually, we're going to be doing some shout outs for non-Neo cards that we added a little bit later, most of which were put in here to sort of reinforce the reworks that we made. And I'll let you know right now, a lot of the cards that we're going to be talking about were actually included to reinforce this sort of blue-white theme.
Moving on to white-red, it's a much bigger change fundamentally, but I actually think the amount of tinkering we ended up having to do was probably less, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. We just basically cut all the bad samurais, and we allowed white-red to do what red wanted to be doing, which is synergizing with artifacts. And that's what this deck does. It's an aggressive deck. It synergizes with artifacts. It's another off-ramp for mono red in this environment. Probably doesn't come together very often because there's not a lot of reason to. You get a lot of power for going into one of the three other colors that are realistic, right? White, blue, and black are all good off-ramps. And potentially, if Gruul works, green is also an off-ramp. So there's not a lot of reason to be a mono red deck in this environment. White red was actually probably the most busted deck. Initially, I've told this story a bunch. So if you haven't heard it, I'll let Chris talk about his experience with it. But the first 2 weeks of this environment, we had some of the modular creatures in this, and it was very, very silly.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that a little bit later, but we saw the theme in Modern Horizons of the modular creatures, and we were like, oh, that should work here. We should have known off the bat that it was just going to be completely and totally insane, and it was, but we'll be discussing that a little bit later. So one of the ways that we enabled white-red to be another flavor of artifact deck outside of black-red and blue-red was we added some artifacts into white, but the artifacts that we added are kind of designed to have good utility and not just be purely aggressive cards, because we wanted the artifacts that we were adding in white to work well in the blue-white and the black-white kind of mixed permanent type sort of deck. So the way that the white-red artifact deck plays out in its current iteration is it's a little bit mid-rangier and a little bit more value-oriented than black-red, mono-red, or blue-red, and it kind of gives it its own identity, which we're a big fan of. Again, we'll be talking about some cards a little bit later that kind of reinforce this theme. So actually, Teld, do you want to talk about the two uncommons we decided to play? Because I know one of them is like one of your favorite cards in Magic.
So the main payoff for the red-white deck is Renegade Wheelsmith, which is a 1 red, white, 3/2. And whenever it becomes tapped, target creature can't block this turn. Most of the time, that's just going to mean when it attacks, it falters a creature, which is pretty good for this deck. It lets you get some early game aggression in. One of my favorite cards in Magic is Reconstruct History from Strixhaven, and it is 2 red, white for a sorcery. Return up to 1 artifact, enchantment, instant, sorcery, and planeswalker from your graveyard, and then exile Reconstruct History. So we don't have any planeswalkers in this cube, but it is not unrealistic for this card to be a draw 3, draw 4 for 4 mana, which is a great amount of value. It's kind of a shout out to the fact that in the original Neo, the way you played red-white, if you wanted it to work, was this kind of goofy control deck around playing a bunch of cheap removal and synthesizers, and then the rest of your deck is Imperialas. And so that's kind of where this is a nod to, but it's just a good value card. Again, red-white has the ability to go a little longer than maybe some of the other decks. And honestly, all of the red decks have kind of got their own flavor of value. The white cards add a lot of onboard value. The blue cards give you a lot of grindy, card advantage with Containment Construct, and we'll get there. And black-red obviously has like reach with stuff like Oni Cult Ample. So red-white has played really well. It's been 2-1-ing, or I believe it's 2-1'd or 3-0'd every single draft we've launched of this format. The guy playing red-white did really well. Outside that first week or two where we had the modular stuff, it hasn't been dominant, but it's been a very good competitive deck, which is exactly what we would hope, right? Is that this deck just works, you can draft it, you feel good about it, but it's not overbearing anymore.
100%. One thing I wanted to mention before we move on to the next color pair is that Reconstruct History is actually a really, because like this is a format where like splashing things is very possible. Reconstruct History is a pretty good splash in your black-white or blue-white, mixed permanent value deck, right? Because you're going to be playing removal, you're going to be playing artifacts, you're going to be playing enchantments. If you splash this into your deck, it's really not inconceivable for it to be like a draw 3 that gets the 3 best cards out of your graveyard.
And that was one thing we did try to do with the quote unquote, like we said, we had a 2-1 split of the signpost cards. The extra card, that third card in the signpost, generally speaking, we tried to make it a card that you could like potentially play in other decks. Like for example, for the aggressive colors, it tends to be a little bit more of a grindy card, or for the grindy colors, maybe it's a little more of an aggressive card. Things that you would play in those decks, but maybe you want to splash for another deck just to kind of give a little bit of variety to the format.
Right. So moving on to blue-red, early on, Teld kind of identified, because I think we both played a lot of Neo, that blue-red kind of felt like the weakest of the artifact. It felt like a little unfocused compared to black-red or just straight-up mono-red. So we were looking for something additional for blue-red to do. And one of the things about blue-red is, the Modern Age and some other cards that we added, like Scrapwork Mutt and the 2-drop oil counter creature that rummages, is that they work really, really well with Containment Construct to just straight up generate card advantage by filtering your hand and then being able to cast those cards. It kind of functions like a soft combo deck. We originally went overboard because we wanted the deck to work. We were playing 4 Containment Constructs, and the first week, I think the player that drafted it saw 90% of their deck and risked decking like every single game without exaggeration. So we've since cut back on the number of Containment Constructs that we're playing, but that's sort of blue-red's identity. This was not a complete rework. It was a subtle rework to kind of facilitate this card advantage-y, hand-filtery game plan that is distinct from black-red or our redesign of white-red.
Yeah, the other goal of this, where we were trying to make blue-red a real deck, is that Replication Specialist is an insanely sweet card, but it's a card in the initial set that doesn't really have a home. And honestly, in blue-red, it looks pretty good now. It's a little expensive and slow to get going, but once you get it in play, it pippity pops off.
Right. So basically, what we've arrived at is that blue-red as an artifact deck actually has a distinct identity from black-red. And that's what we were going for. The last kind of archetype, it didn't really get reworked so much. We basically cut Shrines. We're aware that Shrines is a deck that people remember from Neo, but I'll be honest, I never really attempted to draft it. Did it even really work in the original set, Teld?
I mean, I thought the black and the white shrine were both fine, and you could play them in black white with Shrine Steward. It gave you like the balance thing, and it was a really solid grindy engine. But outside of those two, I really didn't buy into the Shrines deck. Some people like to play the green one occasionally because it could get really big. But the red one, if I recall correctly, and the blue one were two of the lowest win rate cards in the set. And most of the time, if your opponent was playing like 4-color shrines, you probably won unless like the draws were pretty lopsided, like theirs was really good and yours was horrible. No, I did lose a number of times to Shrine because my opponent would just play 4 basic lands of 4 different colors and play like all their cards on curve. And just like, well, that's magic. How did you pull that one off? But yeah, the only decent Shrine is like the Ghost Shintai in white. And even that, we are playing 2 copies at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised if that card gets shaved down to 1. It's a 1/1 factory, but it's a 4-mana 1/3. It's very, very difficult to keep it in play. It's a powerful enough card that in these grindy decks that it can make you infinite number of 1/1 blockers over time. But it's fairly weak. The black one was also kind of passable, but as the power level increased, it became harder and harder to actually make that work. So I would not be surprised if in a year from now there are 0 shrines in this cube. Unfortunately, it doesn't feel like they are individually powerful enough. And if you run all of them, it takes up a huge amount of space. Unfortunately, the other good ones are all just too good, right? The green one that makes 1/1s, the red one that shoots creatures, the black one that drains. If you run all of those shrines on top of the other Ghost Shintais, you have a very parasitic deck that if it gets its kind of Voltron combo together, just absolutely savages your opponent to the point that like there's no reason playing the game. So it just doesn't work. It's either too much real estate and ends up being too good for one player, or it's completely unplayable. There's not a lot of in between, unfortunately.
Right. So let's go ahead and move into talking about some of the non-Neo cards that were added either to rework an archetype or basically provide cool additional support for an already existing archetype. So the first one I'm going to bring up is a little card from, it's either Kaladesh or Ether Revolt. I can't remember which one. It's called Restoration Specialist. It's 1 and a white for a 2/1. And then you can pay 1 white to sacrifice it and return up to 1 target artifact card and up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand.
I believe, Chris, this was the first card when we decided we were going to include cards from outside Neo, where we got into the phone call. It's the first time we're trying to work on this Neo cube, and we both are like, all right, I have a card I want to shout out is that we should include. And we both had Restoration Specialist as like our first card.
Yeah, so spoiler alert, a decent number of the cards that we included from outside sets were from Kaladesh for 2 reasons. A, Kaladesh had an artifact theme, and B, Kaladesh cards, even though it's a kind of a different aesthetic, really focused on technology and robots and things of that nature, which from a flavor perspective made them a pretty solid fit for the Neo environment, despite the fact that they look a little different. So once we changed blue-white to a mixed permanent type balance deck, and black-white was already a mixed permanent balance deck, Resto Specialist becomes a really nice little recursion tool that can also basically block, sack it in response, go get an artifact and enchantment out of your graveyard and produce some really significant value. So that card has been great. And if we had just inserted it into a straight up like Neo set cube without changing any of the archetypes, it would really only be a black-white card. But since we reimagined blue-white, this functions very, very well in 2 separate color pairs.
It's good in red-white too, surprisingly, because you end up with a number of enchantments incidentally.
Right.
And while it's not quite as good, it's still like a solid little beater that then like gets you some extra value in the mid game. But it is mostly for that Esper Shard.
Right. Another card that we added was Stonehaven Pilgrim, which is 1 and a white for 2/2. Whenever it attacks, if you control an artifact or enchantment, Stonehaven Pilgrim gets +1/+1 and gains lifelink until end of turn. So this card, again, works very well in the balance decks because it is a lifelinker that keeps you alive while you're grinding for value, and it actually works pretty well in the red-white quote-unquote artifact deck because like you're going to put Spirited Companions in that deck despite the fact that they're enchantments.
Well, you only have to have one or the other, so this card just ends up being a premium too.
Yes.
Yeah, this card is fantastic. It goes surprisingly late for how good it is. But this is, in this cube, this is basically, when you're attacking, this is a 3/3 lifelinker for 2. It's very good. It's not oppressive or anything, but it is pretty premium.
Yes. Another white card that we added was Moon-Blessed Cleric. From AFR, it's 2 and a white for 3/2. When it ETBs, you may search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, then shuffle and put that card on top. So it's a tutor of a kind, but it's not to hand, so it's not technically a 2-for-1. This card can go get a Saga. This card can go get an enchantment-based removal spell. It works well in black-white, blue-white, and green-white. And part of the reason that we're playing it is not that the environment necessarily needed it. It's just in the original Neo set, all of the white 3-drops are terrible.
This card's good though. This card's very good. Even if you're an aggressive deck, like it's fine, right? You play it on 3. Like if you've got, we did just cut down to 1, but if you have the 1 Mechkos, it tutors up Mechkos, so it pushes damage too. But you can get an Ancestor's Arrest to get rid of a blocker on a subsequent turn, or befriending the Moss to fly your creatures. I was playing it last night to go tutor up Behold the Unspeakable, which felt filthy. It felt too dirty to be legal, but this is it's a good solid card that it isn't oppressive because it is a tutor, but it isn't generating card advantage. It's just a very good quality card, and the art's sick.
Yeah, we should note for the vast majority of uncommons, we capped the number of copies at 2. So if each copy ends up in like a different enchantment value deck, you're not going to see it all the time. So it's not like this card is running around everywhere tutoring up enchantments. There are only a couple copies, and they're probably going to be split between 2 decks. And then the last card that I wanted to talk about for white, so as we noted, we added some artifacts for white to produce better crossover between the very artifact-centric red and white. One of those is Hotshot Mechanic, which is just a 2/1 artifact creature for 1, which is obviously good in artifact aggro decks.
Chris?
Yeah?
Can I break something to you?
Sure.
Hotshot Mechanic's in the set.
Oh, it is. Yeah. You're right. It wasn't very good in its...
No, it's better in this environment when you actually have a white artifact aggressive shell.
Okay, fair enough. Overlooked that. Actually never really played it in the original format because white was an enchantment color and it just felt wildly out of place. But with the red-white rework that we did, it works a lot better than it used to.
Yeah, it's fine. It's a Savannah line.
Yeah, exactly. But it also provides an artifact, right? So it triggers all your stuff that cares about artifacts or wants artifacts on board. Citizen's Crowbar, though, is a card that's a little bit more interesting. So, again, 1 and a white, artifact equipment. It's from Streets of New Capenna. When ETBs, you create a 1/1 creature token, and then you attach Citizen's Crowbar to it. So it's got kind of that living weapon thing going on. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has white, tap, sacrifice Citizen's Crowbar, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it has equip 2. So this is like a 2/2 for 2 that can be sacrificed to remove artifacts and enchantments, which are all over the set. It is not really an aggressive card. It's more of a mid-range interactive value card. And as we mentioned earlier, we kind of wanted the red-white artifact, quote-unquote, aggressive deck to have a little bit more like utility in different ways than black-red and blue-red. And the other function that this serves is it is an artifact that you can play in your blue-white or black-white mixed permanent balance deck, tutorable with Arcanist Owl, or not tutorable, but you can draw it with Arcanist Owl and provides nice interaction. So it provides an artifact for your balance effects. It can be found with effects that get artifacts, and it provides interaction with a lot of the more problematic cards.
Yeah, it runs up a little bit on Banishing Slash, which has a harder mana cost. That being said, I mean, these are both like fine cards in the set. Citizen's Crowbar has a lot more synergy. At the end of the day, we really value the gameplay additions that this added, even if it is very similar in effect to Banishing Slash ultimately.
Right. So, Teld, why don't you take us through the blue ones?
Yeah, so for blue, I think the biggest change that we added was we have 4 copies of Malcator's Watcher, which is 1 in a blue for a 1/1 flying vigilance, and when it dies, you draw a card. This isn't anything to write home about, but it does do a number of things. So like for your ninja or your blue-red deck, it is a cheap little aggressive attacker. You know, it's evasive, chips in damage, does really fine there. For your more defensive decks, it's a card that can trade with or threaten to block those network disruptor type cards, you know, the little dorky flyers. And it cycles on death, so usually it's got a relatively high floor. It's just a nice synergy piece that kind of, ties the room together with some of the changes we made. Another card we added is Chrome Prowler. Again, kind of a flexible card. You can play this in your ninjas deck to get a blocker out of the way. It works in your aggressive artifact deck while adding artifact count. And it also works in your blue-white deck as kind of a defensive tempo-y creature that can, tap something down so your opponent can't attack, and maybe now you can threaten to block. The final big change that we made was we added Artificer's Assistant, which is a blue 1/1 flying bird. Whenever you cast a historic spell, you scry 1, and artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic. So a lot of the cards in this set trigger historic. Anytime we get historic support down the road, it's going to be something we consider for this cube because of that. Has a lot of little synergies, but mostly it's just something that we've noticed the ninja deck really likes, to be able to give it an aggressive 1/1 that then helps them, filter out their draws, because they aren't playing quite as much grindy card advantage anymore. They're playing a lot more to the board and playing to tempo. So the assistant fits there. It also works in your blue-red artifacts deck, and you could play it in the balance deck as well if you wanted, though it is a little dorky there.
Yeah, it just does a number of nice things. As you mentioned, Ninjutsu Enabler, payoff for artifacts, payoff for sagas. Just does a bunch of little things in the format, and I think it was a nice addition.
Black only has one card that really matters. It's Emergency Weld, which is 1 in a black for return target artifact or creature from your graveyard to the hand, and then make a 1/1 artifact creature token. Just a solid little value card. We were running Blood Fountain in that spot. We like that this can return artifacts, and Blood Fountain was enabling some loops with Restoration Specialist and providing multiple artifact triggers, which was not where we wanted to be at that time. I think now we could probably reintroduce it and it would be totally fine. But Emergency Well is kind of fitting a nice little slot there and isn't quite as abusable. One other one that I missed is we do have Bladed Battle Fan in here as well. I don't want to mention every single card we run, but that card's a nice little combat trick for a variety of decks. So yeah, there's a few other changes we made, but Emergency Well was one that we wanted to shout out since it's a good little value card that generates an extra artifact that can help you, like in your Rakdos Anvil deck, get extra material on the board.
Yeah, and just one other quick shout out in black. We added Cutthroat Centurion, which is 2 in a black for a 2/2 artifact creature, so it adds artifact count. But you can also sacrifice other artifacts or creatures to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. You can only activate that once a turn, but this has been like a nice little addition to the black-red sacrifice deck. So moving on to red, this first card we initially added 4 copies of and realized that it might be just a little too strong for 4 copies, and that's Scrapwork Mutt. This card is awesome. It is 2 colorless mana for 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So just on its face, it provides an artifact creature, like a little beater, and it also enables your containment constructs or just like fixes your hand. At its best, it's enabling constructs. And it also has Unearth for 1 in a red, which allows you to put an artifact creature back on board to either sacrifice, fix your hand again, whatever. And if you have a construct on board and you cast this card and then you trade it for something and unearth it, like you're really, really doing the thing. So this has been a sweet little addition. We're treating it more like an uncommon than the common rarity that it's printed as, because it has so many synergies and it's just been so good.
Yeah, the blue-red deck that we talked about played like 3 copies of this card, and it was super silly. Very powerful card, super synergistic, great card. Yeah, we also run a couple copies of Sweatwork Brawler. It's 3 in a red for a 3/3 with Improvise and Menace. Improvise lets you tap your artifacts in order to help pay for the mana cost. So there's a lot of really explosive lines with this card where, you have some things that, you get a couple of 1/1 tokens on the board that are artifacts or something like that. You tap your reconfigure creatures after you've equipped them. You can do all kinds of little cheeky things like that. So Sweatworks Brawler usually ends up being an undercosted Menace threat. This is one of the ones that we moved to after the modular stuff that gives you that nice explosive payoff without being completely degenerate.
Yeah, and actually one kind of cute synergy to note, we haven't playtested this card yet because we just added it, but we added a card called Tinker's Tote, which is a 3 mana card from LCI that makes 3 artifacts in one card. So Teld pointed out to me that on turn 4, you can play Tinker's Tote and just like immediately tap all of the artifacts that it makes to play a 1/1 3/3 menace, which is going to be like a very, very nice line. Another card that we added is Bitter Reunion from the Brothers War. This is 1 and a red. For an enchantment, when it ETBs, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. So this enables containment constructs in blue-red. It also provides an enchantment for anything in your green-red deck that might incidentally care about enchantments, because there are green cards that do. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice it to give creatures you control haste until end of turn. So it's just like a nice little hand fixer that has some small synergies and can also power out your larger green or red creatures to really zerg down your opponent.
And then the last major player that we got is right after we started trying to say, what if we didn't write off green red? What if we tried to fix it? We were right in the middle of mom spoilers when they spoiled Karsus Depth Guard, which is 2 and a red with Defender. And as long as it has power 5 or greater, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. It's a 4/3. So if you get 1 point of power on it, so any of the reconfigured creatures or a +1 counter, it's a pretty overstated creature that is kind of like a weird modified payoff for us, because we kind of view it as like signaling that this deck wants to be defensive in the early game and then pivot to an attacking role. And that's kind of how it's played out, right? Is the Karsus Depth Guard comes down to defend you for a turn or 2, you get it equipped, and then it's like really overstated. That's sort of what we've looked at in our test games with it. So it wasn't like a world beater or anything, but it was nice that right as we were trying to fix green red, we got a card that kind of went right into what we wanted out of it.
All you got to do is slap a Rabbit Battery or +1/+1 counter on it, and it's a 5/4 for 3, which feels a lot better than a 3/4 for 3.
Yeah, we ended up not including it, but we were considering playing the fight spell out of LCI. It's a green and it fights creatures, but if the creature interplay that turn, you get a +1 counter. And it would be excellent with this card, right? Because it would be a big overstated creature that you could fight with that then would let it attack on the next turn. We ultimately decided not to include that because this set already has a bunch of fight and bites, but it was a consideration. So moving into green, there's Evolving Adaptive. This was one of the cards that we signaled as an oil card that we wanted to run. It's kind of got the Experiment 1 vibe. So it is a green for a 0/0, enters play with an oil counter on it, gets +1/+1 for each oil counter. And whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it has greater power or toughness, then you put another oil counter on it. So this is a 1 mana modified creature that will scale up when you start playing your overstated creatures. And when your sagas flip, it can get multiple triggers in a turn. Just a really, really solid card that kind of signals the theme we're running there.
100%. We also, we were starting with more, but we cut down to 1 copy. It's been pretty solid. Is Ren's Run Hydra from one of the Modern Horizon sets. This is, as the name implies, the Hydra name implies, it is X and a green for a 0/0 with reach, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. If you cast it normally, it's a slightly understated creature, but enters as a modified creature and has reach to deal with like the flying creatures that enable ninjutsu, things like that. But it also has Reinforce X, where X is X green, and you can discard this creature. Notably, you can do this at instant speed to put X +1/+1 counters on target creature. So you can use this in the middle of combat as a combat trick. Obviously, it has good synergy with Karthus Depth Guard. And it does a couple of neat little things for the modified deck, while frankly just being like a solid defensive card in like any green deck.
And then the final major shout out for green was Maulfist Revolutionary. We mentioned that earlier in the episode. So it's 1 green for a 3/3 with trample. And when it EPBs or dies, you get to put an additional counter for each type of counter on target, permanent, or player. Again, just kind of a beady face creature that will kind of synergize with some of your other things. You can combo it with Evolving Adaptive, where you play it, you put the counter on it from it coming into play, and then target it with the ability, and you're shipping with like a 3/3 or a 4/4 pretty early into the game. So a lot of little synergy like that. There's a few other things throughout there that we added to like make modified work or to kind of give you these snowbally sort of effects. But ultimately, that's going to be like the major players that we added. You know, like I said, about 3/4 of the cube is still native Neo cards, and about 25% of them are new cards. And some of these changes, you know, we've kind of got them in line now. But Chris, when we first started, there were some of these changes worked a little too well, didn't they?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, white-red was just completely fucking degenerate. Because we made the mistake. I had never played with modified cards before, so I don't think I respected how powerful the mechanic was. So our thinking was like the red ones come in pre-modified for the modified stuff. They're artifact creatures, so they are good in red. Adding some artifact creatures to white, provided some more white cards that would work well in what we were targeting as the new red-white archetype. But we also included some cards other than Arcbound Shikari, which was just obviously a completely insane by itself. But we include some other cards that ended up being really insane. So one of them was Mandible Justiciar, which is from 1. It's 1 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature with lifelink. And whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So
we should have recognized that this was going to be too good.
We played 4 copies of it too.
Tawashi Songshaper is a very good card in this set for the red aggressive decks, and this is better on every single angle.
Yeah, pretty much. All you need is to have 1 artifact enter the battlefield, and it's a 3/2 with lifelink for 2. It wasn't uncommon to lay down 2 artifacts in a turn and have this attack as a 4/3 lifelink. What really made it problematic was not only was it consistently a mid-size to, in some cases, huge attacker, but because of the lifelink, the other aggressive decks had no prayer whatsoever of racing this card.
Yeah, and if you happen to draw the Mechicos, because that is the best aggressive enabler in the format, it was just lights out. You were shipping in with a 10 power lifelinker, which is still possible. You can still do that with Stonehaven Pilgrim, but it's not nearly as synergistic or consistent.
No, this card was not only was it an egregious mistake, but we played 4 copies of it to start, and it was in the deck that already had Modular and Arcbound Shikari in it, so it was just especially insane. Arcbound Shikari could put +1/+1 counters on it and trigger it in the same turn. It was just absolutely bananas. So we had all that stuff. Then we cut all of the modular cards, and I think we kept 2 copies of Mandible Justiciar, and we were okay, Arcbound Shikari is still a good value card, for the red-white artifact aggressive deck. It itself has modular, but it's not supporting a bunch of other modular creatures, so maybe that's tame enough. And then we ended up having to cut that too, because it as a card by itself was just too nuts. So we went through 2 rounds of cuts to get white-red in control. The first week, it was just the best deck, and it just was not even close.
Yeah, the other best deck at that time was blue-red, and blue-red had a very simple problem. It had 1 too many containment constructs. It was just a little too easy to play a containment construct, have it die, and just have another one sitting in your hand because you drafted 3 of them. So we cut a copy, and since then there were a couple other structural changes that kind of honed in the power of these artifact aggressive decks. And since then, blue-red hasn't been a problem. People haven't been drafting it, but I think that's more of just people aren't familiar with it. And so I think it is much more powerful than perhaps people think it is, because they remember how it was in original Neo. We think that one's probably in a good spot, though. You could pretty consistently do the thing, but if your opponent interacts with your containment construct, the doing the thing isn't just a given, right? You aren't playing 3 or 4 copies of the containment construct usually, because I, for example, was playing 1 copy of the construct in my 3 Modern Age deck, right? And so there are decks that if they get enough of these cards, or they get a network terminal, which is the original combo, you might just put a containment construct in your deck, so you do have to value them quite highly.
Yeah, so not only were we playing too many copies of Construct, but when we added Scrapwork Mutt before we just kind of realized it was too ridiculous to be a 4 of, we had 4 of them as well. So you have access, if you count the Unearths, you have access to 8 sort of triggers of Scrapwork Mutt, which was completely insane with the Constructs. Not only was it too powerful, but you also routinely threatened to deck yourself, which was a problem. So we've made some changes to kind of reduce the consistency of the deck and also protect you from drawing your entire deck and losing that way. That was an interesting spot where we started, but we've toned it down a little bit.
Yeah, we definitely learned that sometimes, those changes work too well. And that was a big deal. Is we wanted these things to be impactful so that people would actually play them. But when it turns out this is the best thing to be doing at your table, that was a problem.
So, as we mentioned earlier, for the archetypes that worked in original Neo, we decided to play 2 copies of the original 2-color Signpost and 1 other card to add some additional flavor. And originally, the sort of bonus 2-color card for green-white was Satyr Enchanter, which, let me see if I can remember this off the top of my head. It's 1 green white for a 2/2, and whenever an enchantment ETBs under your control, you draw a card. And again, this maybe should have been obvious to us, but Satyr Enchanter was completely insane because like we wanted to keep it at like pretty much like a limited plus power level, and we mainly stuck to the removal in the native set. So it largely is cheaper or similarly costed to a lot of the things that interact with it. So it was difficult to get like tempoed out by like a cut down or a shock or something like that. And if you untapped with it, you could just cast like a piece of enchantment based removal, take out your opponent's best creature, and also draw a card, and it just got even nuttier from there. You could just cast Spirited Companion and draw 2 cards. It was just too much. Yeah, so that's since been changed out for a card called Renegade Rallier from the Kaladesh block. It's 1, a green, and a white for a 3/2, and it has Revolt. When it enters the battlefield, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, return target permanent card with Convert a mana to cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this works really well if you play it on the turn that a Saga flipped. Because it technically leaves the battlefield and then lands again, you play Renegade Rallier and you can recur a creature. Or, you could trade off your Generous Visitor in combat if it was like large enough to have good attacks and maybe 2 for 1 your opponent on blocks. Then you can just play Renegade Rallier, return it straight to the battlefield. So it has some like nice utility. It's not strictly synergistic with enchantments, which is what the green-white deck is, but it has some nice edges with sagas and some other things that are going on in green-white.
Yeah, and the general play pattern of these decks is to play like a Bamboo Grove Archer or a Fang of Shigeki and trade it off in combat. And then so you can do that defensively. And then once you get your revolt set up, you can buy it back so that you reinforce your defenses. So it kind of does play well in the sense that you have 8 creatures that frequently find themselves into the graveyard in these green and white decks.
Right. And then the last thing that we mentioned, and it might not be problematic anymore, but it was problematic at the beginning of the format before things like sped up a little bit. That was the Blood Fountain loop with Restoration Specialist. Blood Fountain is 1 mana or 1 black mana for an artifact when it ETBs create a blood token. So for your black-red artifact decks, it was 2 artifacts to sacrifice or utilize for the price of 1 mana, which is really good. And then you can pay 3 and a black and tap it to sacrifice it and return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. So one of the patterns in grindier games, especially 2 mid-range decks, is you would sacrifice your Restoration Specialist to get like Blood Fountain and maybe like a good enchantment creature out of your graveyard. And then you would just play Blood Fountain, sacrifice it, get your Resto Specialist back and one other creature and just loop them for tons of value. So we may reconsider adding this card, but when we first introduced it, it came across as a little too strong.
Yeah, and there is the Turtle Season of Renewal loop, and this also enabled you to loop with the Blood Fountain and the Turtle. But the biggest difference with that was that is an explicitly late game loop that also takes a ton of mana and doesn't impact the board. The Restoration Specialist being able to block and only cost 3 mana to do that is like kind of fogged a creature while it was getting you all of this value. And that actually made a pretty big difference in terms of how the games played out, because the Turtle loop is glacially slow by comparison in the way that it only impacts you're like having to spend 6 mana to get a card and get nothing else out of the deal.
Right. So that kind of comprises all of the lessons that we learned, stuff that was too strong, stuff that we over supported. One thing that we definitely learned, so one thing we probably should have mentioned at the top of the episode is, I personally, and Teld, I think you probably agree, one of the things that I really do not like about Set Limited, especially what are like typically referred to as Prince formats, which is to say that like it really revolves around how powerful the rares are, is I really hate playing a game of limited Magic where most of your cards are like 4s and 5s, and then someone revolves like an unrestricted cube-worthy 9, and all of a sudden, like, most of what happened in the game up to that point just like does not matter. Like Aquazotz in LCI, or somebody landing a turn 3 Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the original Neo set.
One of the things about this set too is there's a bunch of them. The rares in the set are very good.
Right, and we just didn't want cards in the packs that were like way better than everything else. And I personally think that the play pattern of like, oh, I drew my busted rare and you didn't, so I win is just dog shit gameplay.
I was going to say one of the cool things about this set is the uncommons. Some of them are so powerful they kind of function like rares. We have cards like Patchwork Automaton, Mechiko's Ray of Truth, the Boseiju 4-mana Saga, Behold the Unspeakable. These are all like cards that kind of play out like rares. They're very, very powerful. They do a extremely, game warping thing. But because they're uncommons, they're a little bit more reined in than the Neo rares. And so they're powerful, and some of them we've had to cut down to one copy of, but they're still good cards that are like excitable picks that will blow anything else out in the pack. But you're not so powerful they're just going to win the game on their own most of the time.
Right. The reason we mention that is like some players have expressed that they don't like the lack of rares. We're going to stick to our guns on this one for the reasons that we just outlined. But it just illustrates sometimes what your goals are for an environment are just not going to be for everyone. Another thing that some players have expressed is that green mid-range decks and ninjas are really great and might be problematic. That is pretty much how the set worked, but it is also possible that these decks are a little over-supported. So those are some archetypes that we're keeping an eye on and we may need to make an adjustment to. And Teld, I want you to speak to this last one because you had the conversation with our member Drix.
So Drix came in and he just said, I wasn't expecting this cube to be so stressful. And after I asked him what he meant, he told us that basically the gameplay on this cube from what we've created is existing in like a Razor's Edge scenario where every single decision for like the first several turns of the game matters down to like, did you play your 1-drop on 1 or did you play a tap land? And you're constantly having to evaluate these complex board states with like, attacks that may or may not work out depending. There's so many things to keep track of. These games are extremely complex for a retail limited-esque set that like he was expecting kind of a chill Neo Cube, Neo vibe, like the original set. Instead, it's just this like every single turn you're having to analyze like 5 different things apparently.
Yeah, so we did, and this is something I tend to like to do with set cubes, is we did cut a lot of the chaff cards that people just don't want to draft, don't make decks, they don't want to see in packs. So the format is more powerful than standard Neo Limited, despite the fact that it doesn't include rares. Like the average deck coming out of this Neo Reloaded cube is just going to be more powerful than the average deck that you would draft in straight up box Neo Limited. So it's very nice to hear that it feels like the gameplay is on Razor's Edge, because that's ultimately what I want from the vast majority of my cube designs, is for every decision to feel meaningful. And I think also an observation that the gameplay is on a Razor's Edge is indirectly an observation that the balance is decent, if that makes any sense. So that was really nice feedback. I think we were both happy to hear that, despite the fact that the way it was described was stressful.
Yeah, this cube is, I would say this cube is probably more powerful than like any retail limited set you're going to run into. This cube is exceptionally fast. You have to be thinking about how you're going to survive against the aggressive decks and also how you're going to deal with the big green decks during the draft portion, during deck construction, during gameplay. These are all things you have to think about. Your deck needs to have a plan. Synergy is really important, and the interaction is not the best. And right now, like our biggest goal is figuring out how do we help these slower control decks survive that aren't playing the green cards, and that's mostly in that Esper Shard. They've been doing okay, but there is a little bit of concern there because they lack the kind of in-game power that some of the green decks have, and they lack the speed that some of the red decks have. But we know that they can exist in that middle ground somewhere. So we're just figuring out exactly what that's supposed to look like. And part of that's drafting the cube, right? This is kind of a unsolved format in a way, even though it comes from a format that would be considered solved.
Right. And I just want to kind of build on something that Teld said real quick. When we say the cube is fast, we don't mean it's fast like Phyrexia All Will Be One draft where it's just zerging and racing. What we mean by fast is the quick proactive decks are fast. So even if you are a slower deck, and green piles do win, we wanted to make sure that like green piles, which were sort of famous decks in the original format that people really liked to draft, you need to make sure that you have defensive speed. You want to be drafting your 1/1 Death Touchers. You want to be drafting your Bamboo Grove Archers. You want to make sure that even if your plan is to go to turn 12 or 14, that you have something to do at the latest by turn 2. You have to respect aggro. So anyway, we're just going to move on to some final thoughts and close this thing out. So we didn't really focus on this over the course of the episode. We talked about the construction of the cube. We talked about how we reworked some archetypes that we didn't really work, etc. But I think that if you are thinking about designing your own quote unquote set plus cubes, hopefully the examples that we gave of reworking archetypes that were very parasitic and narrow and didn't really work within the broader context of the set. Ideally, the reworks that we did to sort of tie these color pairs that didn't previously function into the broader set mechanics so that they would function can serve as a guide if you are looking to fix non-functional archetypes in a different set that you are thinking about quote unquote remastering. Like I said, this serves as a little bit of a primer for maybe some of your own limited plus projects that you might want to work on in the future.
Yeah, sometimes you're going to have to dig really deep. We feel like we've exhausted all of our searches looking for things that will work for some of these archetypes, and you find some gems hidden in the mounds and mounds of dirt. You know, it's like, there are some really good ones that we found and some interesting synergies that we've unlocked because of that. And so it makes you, it feels really rewarding as a cube designer because these sort of set cube projects have a set of constraints, right? They have a set of things that you want to keep existing. We don't have 100% flexibility here like we do with our unrestricted cube because we're trying to keep so much of the format at its base, right? Of what the original format had. And so it gets you really creative, like how you solve your problems. And that it's been a really, really fun project. This is the one that I think like I'm personally the most attached to in terms of, the work we've done on it, trying to get it to be a specific thing and seeing it finally like kind of bear that fruit has been really nice.
100%. And like, if you really like to nerd out about cards and sort of sift through piles of cards to look for that perfect thing that's helping you facilitate like an archetype rework or something, like it's not a banger, but like look at Karsus Depth Guard. Like 2 and a red for a 4/3 with Defender, and if you can increase its power to 5, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. This card doesn't say modified on it anywhere. It doesn't say +1/+1 counter or equipment or aura or whatever. But this card lends itself well to like being modified, and this is also a card that if you were designing like a traditional cube, you would never ever take a second look at. It just doesn't serve any function in most projects, but digging through the piles of cards, looking for stuff that facilitated some of these redesigns, you end up looking at these cards that just don't really serve a function in the vast majority of contexts that can be perfect for what you're trying to accomplish. And I think for a lot of people who, as a thought exercise, like to develop multiple cubes, even if they don't own all of them or get to play them very much, I think this can be a really fun exercise for appreciating cards that you never would have thought of before.
Absolutely. Yeah. The number of cards we have stumbled upon that are just kind of like, I don't remember this card existing, but this is sweet. And that's not even counting the ones we've rejected. Like we've had a bunch that were decent fits that we've moved out over time. If you go look through the blog, like it's when you're designing like a traditional cube, most of the time you're excising 99% of the powerful cards ever printed in Magic. You just look at the absolute top tier, right? And this is just something different. We're looking to fit things within a power badge that don't break flavor, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those eureka moments with otherwise dorky cards are really fun. But in any case, we are running a little bit long for a bonus episode, so we're going to go ahead and close this out. Just want to say thanks as always to everyone listening. Thank you for tolerating my poor quality hosting compared to our dedicated professional Tim.
Remember Tim really keeps us from chasing our tails around and going down rabbit holes.
No, I'm sure he'll have plenty of editing to do here. But remember that the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server and draft with us. Give us your feedback on our cubes. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk cube. There's also a lot of discussion about retail, constructed, just everything that's going on in Magic. We've actually had some players with this Friday draft that's been firing note that this is kind of like either their local store closed or they're living in rural areas and their local store is just like too far away to be feasible to like go to F&M every week. And this has kind of become their F&M. This has kind of become their local game store play group, and we're very proud of that. As we mentioned at the top of the episode, we draft our more powerful unrestricted cube, new name pending. on Sundays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and our Peasant Cube and Specialty Cube drafts take place at 7:30 Eastern on Wednesday nights.
That being said, you can apparently draft any day of the weekend now. We're just drafting all the time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's enough membership now. We have a channel called Casual Drafting where anyone can kind of throw out a ping like, hey, does anybody feel like organizing a cube draft? And those have been firing with a lot of regularity. We're likely to add Friday and Saturday cube nights as actual scheduled cube nights. So you can basically cube any day of the weekend when you're off work, which is great. If you're interested in any of that, you can find links to our Discord server wherever you are listening to this podcast. You can also reach us on our socials. You can find us on Twitter or X or whatever they call it now at Jankdiver Gaming. We have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/JankdiverGaming. There's been a slow publication of content to that channel, but we are working on developing more. And you can watch Teld stream at twitch.tv/TeldTalks, which is a name I always appreciated. So once again, thanks to everyone to checking us out. Hopefully this has been interesting content for you. If it is, holler at us on Twitter. We can talk about some other cube projects that are in development or just discuss set cube design or cube design within constraints in general if this is a topic that appeals to you. And yeah, hope everybody has a great week, and thanks for tuning in.
Take care, everybody.
Hey guys, it's your friendly neighborhood Jank Diver Timothy Zaccanino here. Just got done editing the episode, but wanted to say great job on everything. I really enjoyed listening to the NeoCube breakdown. Chris, kudos on that scripted outro read. Smooth stuff. Teld, nice catch on some of those rules text mishaps that I almost assuredly removed from the final cut. Since I wasn't on the episode, I just wanted to sneak in at the end here and just have a quick chat with you guys. First off, I just wanted to gauge how you felt about the episode you just recorded.
Way, way better than everything else.
Wow, really? Teld, do you agree with that? How was the episode for you?
This is the one that I think I'm personally the most attached to.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. You know, I really liked the episode with Theo, but okay. So just another question or two.
Please, come on, give it to us.
Well, I know it's a little selfish, but I wanted to get your opinion of me as a Magic player.
Absolutely bananas.
Oh, that's very kind. How about you, Teld?
Good.
Oh, thanks, guys. That means quite a bit. How about my hairstyle? What would you say about my hairstyle?
It pippity pops off.
Has some nice edges.
No, seriously, thanks, guys. I put a lot of work into it. Now, I don't want to put a divide between all of us on this podcast, but I heard one of you was talking about the other behind their back. Chris, did you have something to say about Teld's playstyle as a Magic player?
Dogshit gameplay.
Wow, those are fighting words. How's that make you feel, Teld?
Hoo-hoo!
Chris, any response?
Ooh.
Okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have brought this up on the podcast. Tell you what, let's focus back on me for a second. Chris, if you could describe me in, 3 words or phrases, what would you say?
Completely insane. Too powerful. Completely fucking degenerate.
All right, I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment, but as long as we're all happy, right?
That's ultimately what I want.
Yeah, me too, buddy. Me too. Anyway, Teld, one final question, and I'll let you guys go. What's your opinion of Usain Bolt?
Exceptionally fast.
All right, well, there you have it, folks. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys, and I can't wait to talk with you on the next episode. See you next time, everyone.